بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. مرحبا جميعا. الله يعطيكم العافية. معكم عمر أبودقة, and today we are going to talk about the third lecture of the anatomy part of the neuroscience module. Okay, قبل ما نبلش الفيديو نوقف على السريع ونصلي على النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام 10 مرات. Okay, starting with this lecture, it's very easy, straightforward, talking about the cerebral hemisphere. As a brief introduction or a review, we have talked about in the previous two lectures about the ventricles, about the fissures, about the dura mater, the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, or of the meninges. In the brain itself, we have talked about the gray matter and the white matter in the spinal cord compared to the brain, and the major introduction to the central nervous system. Today we are going to talk about the organization of the cerebral hemisphere, or let's say talking briefly about the cerebral hemisphere. As we know that the brain is composed of subcategories or three major categories, which are the midbrain, the hindbrain, and the forebrain. And as you know, the hindbrain is composed of the pons, the medulla, and the cerebellum. However, the forebrain, which is the most superior part, or it is the most dorsal part, aware about this directions in the forebrain compared to the spinal cord, or even though in the brain stem, like rostral, caudal, ventral, and dorsal. When I'm saying dorsal in the forebrain, it means superior, and ventral mean inferior. However, when I say dorsal and ventral in the spinal cord, respectively, means posterior and anterior. Okay, so just be aware about these terminology or directions. So the cerebral hemisphere, which is the most dorsal or superior part of the brain, it is the forebrain is composed of two major parts: the cerebral and the diencephalon. And the diencephalon is composed of the thalamus, hypothalamus, subthalamus, epithalamus, and then conjugation, which is not the major subject in our lecture today. So let us talk about the organization of the cerebral hemisphere, how the cerebral hemisphere is organized. And as you know, the cerebral hemisphere is one of the two cerebral hemisphere in the cerebrum. Okay, so again, the forebrain is composed of the diencephalon, which is the center of the brain, and the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, no, again, the forebrain is composed of the diencephalon and the cerebrum. Okay, and the cerebrum. Now the cerebrum itself is subdivided into right and left cerebral hemisphere. These cerebral hemispheres are connected by longitudinal fissure, and as you know, we have talked about the cerebri flexi, or another terminology for it, the longitudinal fissure in the meninges in the second lecture. And those cerebral hemisphere, as we said, it is separated by the longitudinal fissure and connected by the specific projections. Okay, we will talk about them in a moment. So let us talk about the organization of the cerebral hemisphere. The cerebrum is composed of the cerebral cortex. So again, يعني بدنا نوضح فكرة إنه السيربرم itself هو عبارة عن جزئين مكون من السيربرال hemispheres, واحد right واحد left. They are divided by or separated by longitudinal fissure or cerebri flexi and connected by corpus callosum. Okay, so as you know that the brain have gray matter and white matter, and you need to be aware about the different organization of the gray and white matter in the brain compared to the spinal cord. As you know, in the spinal cord, the gray matter is found inner core and the white matter in the outside. However, in the brain, it is completely opposite directions, which means that the gray matter is found in the outside of the cerebrum, and the white matter is inside it, meaning it is in the core, inner part of the cerebrum. Okay, so what is the cerebral cortex? Cortex معناها القشرة، الإشي الخارجي. It is the most superficial layer of the cerebrum, and it is composed mainly of gray matter. So it is the surface layer of each hemisphere consisting of gray matter. أهم كلمة فيها هنا gray matter. It is thrown into folds or gyri. هاي الدكتورة أنا مش عارف كم مرة عدت الجملة، جدا مهمة. Thrown into folds or gyri. تمام؟ معناته هي محطوطة مكونة من إيش؟ من folds أو gyri, which are separated by fissures أو sulci. هدول راح نحكي عنهم هلا كمان شوي. فأنا لما أجي أحكي بهاي الصورة، لو أجي أشوف هذول البروجكشنز اللي هي تموؤات زي هيك up and down waves, those are gyri, and they are separated by lines called fissures and sulcus or sulci for a group of them. Okay, so these folds or gyri are separated by fissures or sulci, and the merging function is to greatly increase the surface area of the cortex. As you know, the cortex is the superior part of the brain, and to increase the surface area to it, we need those folds and gyri which are separated by fissures or sulci. Its surface is subdivided into loops, and depending on the bones that protecting these loops, we will name these loops and we will identify these loops. And before I just talk about the loops, you need to be aware again that the cerebral hemisphere or the cerebrum at all is extending from the frontal lobe anteriorly and going backward to be attached to the occipital wall posteriorly, and through this line they are going to pass over the parietal and the temporal bones. So these four cranial bones is going to be major part of the naming and identification of the loops of the cerebrum. Okay, so the surface is subdivided into loops by number of large sulci. Yes, the loops is being organized by the sulci, as we have mentioned before, or the gyri is being separated by sulci and are named from the bones of the cranium under which they lie, as we have mentioned before. Okay, so the white matter, as we have mentioned also, the white matter is the inner core. The word core is very important، يعني الصميم الاشي الداخلي، تمام. So which is the central core of the cerebral hemisphere، تمام. The white matter, it is the inner side، تمام. There is something called the basal nuclei or ganglia. Actually, the basal nuclei or ganglia, it is a gray matter embedded in the white matter، تمام. So it is several large masses of gray matter located within the white matter of each cerebral hemisphere. It's very clear that it is a gray matter located inside the white matter of the core of the cerebral hemisphere, and there is a major component of the basal nuclei or ganglia. As you can see in the figure in here, okay, as you can see, this is a transverse section of the brain that separates the brain to superior or upper and inferior or lower. As you can see, this is the cortex, which is the gray matter, the outer surface, the most superficial layer of the cerebral hemisphere, and this is the right and left cerebral hemisphere. They are separated by the longitudinal fissure that we have mentioned before and connected by corpus callosum that actually it's not really obvious in this picture. Okay, these are the ventricles and the horns, the lateral, the third, and this is the canal that connect the fourth to the third ventricle, as we talked about it in the previous lecture. This is the third ventricle and most inferiorly the fourth ventricle. Anyway, this is the white matter that we have mentioned, and the white matter is the inner core, the inside of the two cerebral hemisphere. If you just observe this layer, the gray ones, this one also, these are gray matter. You would say, how do we have any gray matter inside the white matter? Because we said that the gray matter is located in the outermost layer or superficially in the cortex of the cerebral hemisphere. But as we have mentioned before, these are the basal nuclei or ganglia. All of them, this one and this one and this one, all of them are part of the basal nuclei or ganglia that we are going to identify this structure in a moment. And I just need you to be aware that these are only gray matter located or embedded, thrown inside the inner core or the white matter of the brain. If you just observe this sagittal section that separate the brain into right and left, you'll be able to see this structure. And actually this structure is the major part of the basal nuclei. As you can see, this is the gray matter and this is the white matter, and also there is a little gray matter embedded in the white matter, which is called the basal nuclei. If you just observe this tail-like structure, the thin long one, this is called the caudate nucleus. These are the subtypes or the subgroups of the basal nuclei. The caudate nucleus have three parts: the body, the tail, and in here most anteriorly we have the head. So the head, the body, the tail. You do not need to be aware about all these details. All you need to know that we have the caudate nucleus. تمام؟ يعني هاي التفاصيل مش كتير مهم نعرفها، ولكن هي المهمة، والموجود في الهاند اوت هو المهم. تمام؟ يعني احنا بالنهاية بدنا ندرس كل الاشياء ولكن بدنا نركز على الاشياء الموجودة بالهاند اوت. This is the body of the caudate nucleus, this is the anterior head of the caudate nucleus, and this is the tail. If you just observe that posteriorly to the head of the caudate nucleus, we'll be able to see a large circular oval nucleus called the lentiform nucleus. And if you just observe that the lentiform nucleus, in addition to the chordoid nucleus, is called the corpus striatum, تمام, which is divided into the chordoid and the lentiform nucleus. So again, the chordoid nucleus, which is composed of the body, head, and tail, and the lentiform nucleus, which is posterior to the head of the chordoid nucleus, is called the corpus striatum. If you just observe this little structure in here, the little circular, most inferior one is called the amygdaloid nucleus. Amygdaloid nucleus, okay? And the final component of the basal nuclei is called the claustrum, which is not identified in that picture. If we observe this section in here that separates the brain to superior and inferior or transverse section, we'll be able to see that this pink structure is the chordating nucleus, okay, and this is the lentiform nucleus. Just forget this part, the doctor did not mention anyway, okay. This is the lentiform, and more laterally for the lentiform nucleus we'll be able to see the claustrum. So the claustrum is a thin layer of the gray matter embedded in the white matter. So these are the major structures of the basal nuclei: the corpus striatum, which is subdivided into the chordoid and the lentiform nucleus, okay, and the little circle downward is called the amygdaloid nucleus and the claustrum. And the basal nuclei, it is several large masses of gray matter located within the white matter of each cerebral hemisphere, okay. Now, the cerebral cortex, the outer layer, which is composed of the gray matter, is composed of 6 major layers, and they are very easy. يعني ما تشوفوا هاي انها كثير معقده، وهاي لا، هي جدا سهله لو احنا نخططها وبس نعرف شو الدكتوره بدها اياه، والدكتوره اللي حكته هو حرفيا اللي موجود في هذه الفقره، تمام، بدون ولا حرف زياده. So these are layers of the cerebral cortex. They extend from the superficial layer of the cerebral cortex extending to the white matter downward, okay. So at the beginning of the white matter there will be a deficient in this layer. Why? Because they are only exclusively found in the cerebral cortex. Starting with the outermost layer is called the molecular. Another terminology for it is called the plexiform layer. This is the most superficial. I'm talking from more superficial to going deeper. Going to the 6th layer, we are going to be at the deepest layer in here, okay? So the molecular layer, which is the most superficial layer, it contains a few horizontal cells of Candle. Actually, these cells and any other cells we are going to talk about in a moment, we do not need to know what is their function or what are these, just know about them, memorize them as they are, okay? So the most superficial layer will contain horizontal cells of Candle, okay? Hopefully I pronounce it correctly, okay? And another thing you need to know that scattered among a dense network of nerve fibers. The nerve fibers, as you know, is called the axons, and once we have mentioned the nerve fibers, there is something that I have missed to say, that we said the cerebral cortex is made up of gray matter, and the gray matter component, the major component of it is the cell bodies, okay? So the cell body is the major component in here. If you can just observe, this is the gray matter. The gray matter is going to have a high number of cell bodies in addition to some dendrites and terminal buttons, but the major component is the cell body, and the white matter contain the major component of the nerve fibers or the axons. When I say the nerve fibers, it means the axons, okay? And this is why it is white. Why? Because we have myelin sheath surrounding the axons, and as you know, there is lipids in the myelin sheath that will give the white color of the white matter, okay, in the inner core of the cerebral hemispheres, okay? So the molecular or the plexiform layer, it is the most superficial layer, contains few horizontal cells of Candle, and I need you to know that it's scattered among a dense network of nerve fibers. scattered يعني منتشرة موزعة. We have the external granular layer, the second one, and aware about the numbers. الأرقام جدا مهمة لازم نحفظهم، تمام. It contains large number of small pyramidal. You know the pyramidal زي هرمي، شكل هرمي، small pyramidal cells and stellate cells, okay? Everything you need to know that it is the second layer and contains the second layer containing the small pyramidal cells and stellate cells with large amount and large number. The external pyramidal layer, okay, so this is the external granular. However, the third layer is the external pyramidal layer. It contains numerous small to medium sized pyramidal cells compared to the small pyramidal cells only in the external granular. In here we have medium sized to small ones, okay, pyramidal cells, and those whose cell body, size increases. So the external pyramidal cells, when I am at the superficial layer, going deeper in the same external pyramidal layer, we are going to have a form of size increasing once we are going deeper and deeper. هلا طبعا راح نشوفها على structure تاني. Fourth, the internal granular layer, aware that the second one is the external and the fourth is the internal granular layer. It is composed of closely packed stellate cells. Okay, so these stellate cells compared to the second layer containing the stellate cells, in here it is closely packed, متقاربين كثير على بعض, and it has the external band of Baillarger. Okay, this is very important because we will have an internal band in the fifth layer. However, the external band of Baillarger are in the fourth layer, and this band consists of a horizontally arranged fibers in high concentration. The most important word that these fibers are in horizontal shape. Okay, so again, the internal granular layer, you need to be aware about two information in it. Okay, it is composed mainly of a closely packed stellate cells, and it has the external band of a Baillarger. These bands have a horizontally arranged fibers in high concentration. Okay, so if you just observe this picture or image in here, you'll be able to see that this is the cross section of the cerebral cortex, made up of the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth, which is the most deeper layer of the cerebral cortex. As we have mentioned before, the molecular layer, the external granular, the external pyramidal. As we have mentioned in here, we have in the second layer stellate cells and small pyramidal cells. You can be able to see the small size pyramidal cells, and in the external pyramidal layer, we'll be able to see the medium to small size of pyramidal cells. Compare this small one and to the medium one. However, in the fourth layer, we'll be able to see these lines, the horizontal fibers in the black color, which have the external band of the Baillarger. Talking about the fifth layer, which is named as the Ganglionic Layer, or another name as the internal pyramidal layer. Okay, the internal pyramidal layer. Okay, because we have the external pyramidal layer, this is the internal pyramidal layer called the ganglionic layer. It contains very large and medium size. So again, in the first layer, the second layer, we have small pyramidal cells. Okay, in the third layer, we have small to medium-sized pyramidal cells. In the fifth layer, we are going to have large and medium-sized pyramidal cells, which are known as bed cells. Very, very important information. The bed cells, what is the bed cells? Actually, the doctor identify or define the bed cells as a large pyramidal cells in the fifth layer, okay? As simple as that. So the bed cells, these are the large pyramidal cells found exclusively in the fifth layer, and these bed cells, we'll be able to find them in the motor cortex of the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is the anterior side of the central gyrus that we are going to talk about in a moment. Just aware that the bed cells is found in the motor cortex, in the anterior part of the central gyrus, which is called the precentral gyrus, or in the frontal lobe. Aware about the motor cortex and the bed cells, which is called the large pyramidal cells, and in the ganglionic layer we'll be able to see large and medium-sized pyramidal cells, and among which are stellate cells again and Martinuti scaffold. So these are two subtypes of cells again. What are these cells? The stellate cells and cells of Martinuti. Okay, طبعا I'm not that much familiar with the terminology. Okay, the stellate cells and the Martinuti. We'll be able to see these cells in the fifth layer. Again, the external or the internal, we will have an inner band of the Baillarger. The external one is found in the fourth layer. However, the inner band of the Baillarger will be able to see it in the fifth layer and has a large number of horizontally arranged fibers like the internal one. Just this is the inner and this is the external. If you just look in here, this is the fifth layer containing stellate cells, Martinuti cells, and the large Barth cells in the motor area of the precentral gyrus, and we will be able to see in here the inner band of the Baillarger that contains horizontal fibers. Finally, the multiforme layer, layer of pleomorphic cells, The multiforme layer, it contains the following cells. First of all, it contains the fusiform cell, the modified pyramidal cells, and cells of Martinuti, as we have mentioned in the fifth layer. So the multiforme layer contains the following cells again, the fusiform. All the thing that you need to know is these lines, okay? The fusiform have the majority of the cells in this layer. يعني أكبر عدد منهم مكون من fusiform cells. Modified pyramidal cells هذول عبارة عن إيش؟ Whose cell bodies are triangular or ovoid. That's all? Yes, that's all. And cells of Martinuti, just know that they are existent in the fifth and sixth layer, okay? So again, the sixth layer contains fusiform. It's called pleomorphic cells. Why? Because it contains variety of sizes, shapes of cells. For example, you have the fusiform cells. they compose the majority of the cells. The modified pyramidal cells, whose cell bodies are triangular or ovoid in shape, and finally the cells of maturity, and this is the sixth layer and the final layer. I do not know what is this structure, and actually the doctor did not give it that interest that much, okay? She just say about that inner band and the external band in the fourth and the fifth layer of the larger, okay? Just as a brief information about the external and internal band of the bilateral, both of them is numerous and found in sensory areas, okay? Actually this information the doctor said in the lecture. So the bilateral يعني هي مش بقدر أهمية الإشي المكتوب هون، بس حكتها الدكتورة إنه هو إحنا بنلاقيهم وين؟ في السنسوري areas، تمام؟ اللي هي موجودة في البرين. Now going to columnar organization of the cerebral cortex. What are the columns? Columns هي عبارة مش إحنا حكينا إنه أنا عندي 6 layers. Those 6 layers will form columns. And aware about the word functionally. So the cerebral cortex is functionally organized into vertical units or columns. When I say functionally organized, we need to be knowing that I'm talking about the vertical or columns in that longitudinal direction, okay? For example, each column in the sensory cortex serve as a single specific sensory function. يعني الكولوم هذا عبارة عن إيش؟ عنده specific sensory function. مثلا ممكن يحتوي على afferent nerves، على efferent nerves. هلا راح نشوف خلال ثواني، تمام؟ يعني هذا عبارة عن example بسيط إنه الكولوم is a sensory cortex serve as a single specific sensory function. يستقبل إيش؟ nerves، بعطي efferent verbs. And it extends through all 6 layers. This sentence is very important, that the columns are extending from the first to the 6th layer of the cerebral cortex. All of them are included within. From the cortical surface to the white matter, and from the cortical surface to the white matter, this is the major extension of the cerebral cortex and its 6 layers, okay? Okay, now I am moving to the final or the pre-final slides، لأنه صراحة ترتيب السلايدات مش كتير منيح يعني. Anyway إحنا قبل شوي حكينا عن الكولومز المعمولة من إيش؟ من 6 layers. And these columns is in this picture is very obvious, okay? So this is the 6 layers of the cerebral cortex, the first, second, and the most deadly one going to the 6th one, okay? So these are the columns. They are nothing, but they are, it's not true columns. Actually, they are the joining or the vertical joining of the 6th layer together. There is an important information that the doctor have mentioned, that the 4th layer is the chief input of these columns, okay? There is something called the projection fibers getting outside and inside to the columns, okay? If you just observe that the 5th layer have an outside nerves, this is called the efferent pathway, and when we say efferent, we name it as corticofugal, okay? Corticofugal. Efferent meaning going away of the central nervous system, meaning it's going to the brainstem, to the spinal cord, to the striatum. Again, we have fibers getting inside the columns, going to the brain, going to the cerebral cortex, getting closer, named as afferent ones. And when we say afferent, going to inside, we call it corticociptal, okay? And those corticocipitals and corticofugal named as the projection fibers. So any afferent or efferent fibers getting away or toward the cerebral cortex, or even though to the central nervous system throughout the thalamus. As you know, the thalamus is the joining a lot of the sensory or motor nerves, called the projection fibers. Any afferent or efferent nerves getting out or in toward the cerebral cortex in the brain, in the central nervous system, is called as our projection fibers. Another thing to know, that we have commissural and association fibers. Those are not having any nerves endings like afferent or efferent. These fibers have a supporting, connecting the two cerebral hemisphere together, or connecting the structures on the same cerebral hemisphere. If we say this is the right hemisphere and this is the left, and this is the longitudinal fissure that, or the cerebri flexi that separate the two cerebral hemisphere of the cerebrum of the forebrain. Any fibers that get out of the left or the right cerebral hemisphere and extend above or below the longitudinal fissure going to the second cerebral hemisphere is called the commissural. However, if I have any fibers getting from one cerebral hemisphere and insert to another structure in the same, aware about the word in the same cerebral hemisphere, is called association fibers, okay? And these fibers is administered in these slides. Okay, so these are the fibers in the hemispheric white matter. Okay, again, types of fibers in the hemispheric white matter. Aware that these fibers is inside the white matter. Okay, so these fibers are inside the white matter. Why is that? Because we said that the columns extends from the cerebral cortex, the most superficial, going to the white matter, even though these 6 layers is found in the cerebral cortex. Okay, so these fibers is found in the white matter, and they connect the structures of different hemispheres or the same hemisphere. First of all, we have the association fibers that we have mentioned before. Those are essentially connecting various cortical regions within the same hemisphere. Look at the figure in here. Within the same hemisphere, we did not extend above the longitudinal fissure. No, I am within the same hemisphere. Those fibers. You need to be aware that we have short group of them and long group of them. Just know about them that the short group lie immediately beneath the cortex and connect adjacent gyri. يعني هي تحت الكورتكس تماما، ما بين الكورتكس والوايت ماتر، وبتعمل لي كونكشن لمين؟ للجايراي. Okay? دائما الجايراي I'll be able to see it in the cortex more obviously in the superficial layer. And the longer group includes the cingulum. Aware about the cingulum, it's very important, and we will talk about it in a moment. Okay, the cingulum, the superior longitudinal fasciculus, the inferior longitudinal fasciculus, those, and the doctor mentioned another one, the arcuate fasciculus and the uncinate fasciculus. Aware that they arise from layer 3. If you just observe in here, this is the 3rd layer of the cortex, and all of the fibers, either they are association within the same hemisphere or commissional within another cerebral hemisphere, all of them arise from the 3rd layer, and all of them insert to the 2nd and 3rd layer, to the 2nd and 3rd layer, sorry, and the doctor say in some cases we'll have a 4th layer. Okay, just know about the 2nd and the 3rd layer is the major insertion, and the 3rd layer is going to be the origination of these fibers. So they arise from the 3rd layer and indeed chiefly in layer 2 and 3, as we have seen. They include short association like this one immediately under the cortex or beneath the cortex connecting adjacent gyri, and they meet the superficial longitudinal fasciculus, which is categorized as a long one. If you just observe this picture in here, you will be able to see that these are the fibers that connect several parts inside the white matter. So these fibers are inside the white matter, and we name them association fibers. Why? Because they connect structures or cortical region, meaning in the cortex. Okay, we know that they are in the white matter, but they connect various cortical regions. So they have a form of overlapping between the cortex and the white matter. They are in the white matter, but they connect cortical regions within the same hemisphere. The same hemisphere is very important, okay, because commissional fibers is between 2 different hemispheres. Anyway, the longer group includes the cingulum, the fasciculus, superior one, the inferior one, the arcuate one. If you just observe in one here, this is the superior longitudinal fasciculus, and the doctor said that it connects the interior, the inside part of the frontal lobe going to both the occipital and the temporal lobe. So it will not pass over the parietal, no, from the interior part of the frontal lobe going to the temporal and the occipital loops. اوكي، هذه مش موجوده بالهاوندات المعلومه، بس الدكتوره حكتها، ما بدنا نركز عليها قد ما بدنا نركز على الموجود بالهاند اوت، ولكن بدنا نعرفها من الانتيريور frontal lobe going to the temporal and occipital. However, we have in here the arcuate. Where is the arcuate? This is the arcuate fasciculus. Okay, is another long association fibers connecting cortical structures in the same cerebral hemisphere, and this is the uncinate fasciculus. We have another inferior, this is the uncinate fasciculus. This is only a figure to see these cingulum or superior uncinate fasciculus. Not all of them is obviously in the picture. Talking about the commissional fibers, these are essentially connecting corresponding regions of the 2 hemispheres, which means انه انا بنط من فوق اللونجيتودينال فيشر عشان اروح على السكند hemisphere. They are the corpus callosum. حكينا عنه ولا ما حكينا كثير انه هو معمل connection between the 2 cerebral hemisphere. The anterior commissure, the posterior commissure, the pharynx, and the habenular commissure. Just everything you need to know is to memorize those structures. Okay, they arise from layer 3 and as well as the association fibers insert into layer 2 and layer 3. Finally, the projection fibers, the afferent and the efferent, as we have mentioned before in the columns, that are afferent and efferent. Efferent going away, afferent going into, that connects the cortex to the subcortical center. هاي جدا مهمة. subcortical المنطقة ما تحت الكورتكس، وبالتالي they connect the structures cortex to the subcortical centers. صح ولا لا؟ شفنا انه كيف تنزل عندك الافرنت على السباينال كورد، وعندك الثالمس بتطلع لي افرنت بتروح لي على layer 4. They form a compact band known as the internal capsule that we will talk about in a moment. الانترنال capsule هاي الكبسولة الداخلية، تمام. They arise chiefly from layer 5 زي ما حكينا, and some arise from layer 6. Who are these? Are the projection fibers, تمام. They are classified as corticofugal if they carry impulses away from the cortex. Efferent corticofugal, away from the cortex, corticofugal. Corticopital or corticopital if they carry impulses toward the cortex from the thalamus going to the fourth layer, extending in there to form the afferent pathway. Just a little information about that they arise chiefly from layer 5 and 6. In these two sentences, I am talking about the efferent pathway, okay, because the afferent arises from the fourth layer. Okay, just be aware about this information, because if you just observe in here, in some cases we will have the sixth layer arising of the efferent, and in the most cases we will have the efferent arising from layer 5 going downward to the subcortical region. However, the afferent pathway, which is called going toward the cerebral cortex, is the corticopital going to the fourth layer, and this is again the association and the commissional fibers going to the another cerebral hemisphere, and the association fibers, as we have mentioned before, the superior, the inferior, the cingulum, the long and short ones extending to the same cerebral hemisphere, and both of them, the commissional and association, arise from the third layer and insert into the second and third layer. In some cases, rare cases, will have the fourth layer with. Okay, before a moment we have talked about the internal capsule that is being formed by the projection fibers. We said the projection fibers are afferent and efferent and corticofugal, corticociptal, depending on the way they are going toward or outward of the cerebral cortex, and they form a compact band known as the internal capsule. So if there was a question in the exam, which of the following form the internal capsule, it is the projection fibers, and one of them key answer might be the corticofugal or corticociptal. Aware about this point. So what is the internal capsule? Actually, the internal capsule is a center part of the cerebrum. The internal capsule is being formed by projection fibers, as we have mentioned. It is formed by afferent and efferent nerve fibers, as also we have mentioned. We said that projection fibers contain afferent and efferent, and we classify them as both of them based on the going outward or inward, okay, depending on the cerebral cortex columns, passing to and from the brain stem, meaning لأن هم إيش مالهم؟ بمروا من خلال وإلى البرين ستيم. نعرف البرين ستيم بتكون من الميد برين، من البونز ومن الميدالا اوبلونجاتا, and going downward to the spinal cord, and passing to and from the brain stem to the entire cerebral cortex. يعني بمروا من وخلال البرين stem عشان يوصلوا لي على الcerebral cortex، واحنا عرفنا ايش قبل شوي البرين stem، and at the upper part of the brain stem. وبالتالي passing to and from the brain stem to the entire cerebral cortex and the upper part of the brain stem. ما احنا بنعرف انه cerebral cortex is located superiorly to the brain stem، وبالتالي اكيد at the upper part of the brain stem. Now it consists of anterior limb and posterior limb. This is the important information which are continuous with each other and the genome. هلا هدول الجملتين الدكتور حطاهم بالهاند اوت، هم المفروض احنا نعرفهم، ولكن عشان نفهم الصورة اكثر واكثر باجي بطلع على هذه المنطقة هنا. This is the gray matter, the white matter. This is the head of the caudate nucleus. We said this is of course the transverse section separating the brain into inferior and superior, and this is the inferior part of the brain, the downward part looking from superior point of view. This is what the head of the caudate nucleus, and this is the lentiform nucleus of the basal nuclei. If you just observe in here, both the caudate and the lentiform nucleus is part of the basal nuclei, separated by the anterior limb of the internal capsule. The internal capsule, this is the region that I am looking or walking with the pointer. This is the region of the internal capsule. It have anterior with the green one and the posterior with the yellow and the blue and the purple colors. So the anterior lip separate the head of the caudate nucleus and the lentiform. In here, the posterior lip also separate the lentiform from the thalamus. Both the anterior and the posterior are going to cross-link at a specific portion called the geno. What is the geno? In here, we'll be able to see what is the geno. If you just observe this picture in here, this is the corpus callosum, okay? And the corpus callosum have a geno, anterior portion, and in here, this is the posterior portion, okay? So this is the geno, most anteriorly, and this is the most posteriorly called the splenium. Okay, this is an amazing picture that illustrates for us the corpus callosum, which is illustrated in the white colors, and the corpus callosum holds up the two cerebral hemisphere. This is the geno. The geno is the most anterior part of the corpus callosum, and the splenium is the most posterior part of the corpus callosum. Between them is the trunk. Okay, so if you observe this picture, this is a transverse section that is illustrated the anterior and the posterior part, and this is the trunk of the corpus callosum. Okay, so this is the anterior part is called the geno. It is called the geno, and the posterior part is called the splenium of the corpus callosum. What is interesting about the geno or the anterior part of the corpus callosum, that it have a commissure fibers. The doctor said that it has a commissure fibers that is going to form what's so called as the forceps minor, and the forceps minor, as the arrow indicate, it is going or projecting anteriorly. However, the splenium of the corpus callosum also will have a commissure fibers that will form something called the forceps major. Differentiate between the word major and the minor. The forceps minor is going to be in the anterior part of the corpus callosum called the geno and projected most anteriorly. However, the forceps major is going to be formed by the splenium or the posterior part of the corpus callosum and project more posteriorly. This information is not included in the handout, however, the doctor have mentioned it. Okay, just one more thing to mention about the internal capsule, that we have said that we have the anterior limb and the posterior limb. The anterior limb that is located between the head of the caudate nucleus and the lentiform, and the posterior limb of the internal capsule that separate the lentiform nucleus of the basal ganglia or nuclei and the thalamus. There is something that the doctor have mentioned too, that in here we have something that is called the optic radiation, and we need to be aware that this optic radiation, let's say before the optic radiation, we have something that is called in this specific region that is lateral to the thalamus and posterior to the lentiform, something that is called the retrorenticular limb. Again, so we do not just have the anterior and posterior limb, we have the retrorenticular limb that is located posteriorly to the lentiform and laterally to the thalamus. This is the retrolenticular limb, and this retrolenticular limb will give the beginning and origination of the optic radiation. It looks like the teeth in here. This is the optic radiation. The thing that we need to know, and that the doctor have mentioned, that the optic radiation contains fibers of the neurons, of the lateral geniculate of the thalamus. We have the lateral geniculate nucleus and medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. So the optic radiation is being formed by axons of fibers of the neurons of the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. However, in here, this is the auditory radiation. We have both optic radiation and auditory radiation, and the optic radiation is origination from the retroventricular limb in here. The auditory radiation compared to the optic radiation contains fibers or axons of the neurons in the medial geniculate of the thalamus. This is the thing that we need to mention before we end up or move to the loops, because the doctor have mentioned it, but it did not include it in the handout. So moving to the loops of the cerebral cortex. Actually, we have said that we have cerebral cortex loops, and these loops are named according to the bone that covered them. We have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and finally the occipital lobe. There is something called the insular lobe that is located deeply to the lateral sulcus that we will going to talk about in a moment. And all of these loops is named, as we have mentioned, based on the bones that is located below it. Functionally, the cortex consists of numbers areas اللي هم هذول النمبر areas. يعني أنا لما أجي أحكي البرودمان 18 17 هذول النمبر areas هم عبارة عن مرات motor areas, sensory areas. You need to know that they were originally demarcated by Brodmann. في معلومة كمان الدكتورة حكتها مش موجودة في الهاند out that these Brodmann areas are named or numbered based on the psychoarchitecture. Again, this Brodmann numbering is based on the psychoarchitecture, none on the function. Okay, so the numbering of the Brodmann, this is the scientist that discovered them. مش عارف يعني هو Brodmann شخص أو إشي. Anyway, Brodmann is the system that we number the areas in the loops functionally, but when we depend on the numbers, those numbers are based on the psychoarchitecture of those areas inside the cerebral cortex loops. The frontal lobe located anterior to the central sulcus. معلومات هلا راح نفهمهم كلهم، لازم كل واحد يكون مش حافظها فاهمها فهم. تمام. Located anterior to the central sulcus. Poitretial lobe located posterior to the central sulcus. Temporal lobe located inferior to the lateral fissure أو sulcus. في عندك أهم sulcus موجودين في البرين central ولاترال sulcus. والoccipital والinsular lobe. في عندنا المين سالكاي اوف ذا سيربرال كورتكس. زي ما حكينا انا عندي السنترال سالكس والليترال سالكس. السنترال سالكس بتكون موجوده في الميدل سايد. هلا كلياتهم هم راح نغطيهم على الصوره بنفهمهم مع بعض. تمام. هلا the main sulci on the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere are the central sulcus and the lateral sulcus. Aware about the word the lateral surface. يعني انا لما اجي اطلع من البرين من الجهه الليترال in here, this is the lateral view, we'll be able to see that this is in here the central sulcus. تمام. This is the central sulcus. Okay. And again, the central sulcus lies between the two parallel gyri, which are the precentral and the postcentral gyri. هلا رح نحكي عنهم. أول محاضرة حكينا إنه أنا عندي gyri that are separated through the sulci or fissure. وبالتالي أنا عندي central sulci رح يفصل لي frontal lobe from the parietal lobe and forming the precentral gyri in the frontal lobe and the postcentral gyri in the parietal lobe. The lateral sulcus, it has an area of cortex called the insula. قبل شوي حكينا الانسولا، تتذكروا هون حكينا الانسولار lobe. وبالتالي this is ايش؟ the insula lying deeply within it. بطلع هون انه this is what the lateral lobe. And if we observe, no هون ما اتوقع انها بتكون موجودة. لا. In here this is the lateral. تمام. So this is the lateral sulcus and this is the temporal and the frontal and the posterior. هلا لو اشيل الليترال من هاي المنطقة راح الاقي الانسولار lobe. تمام. In here the lateral sulcus, the main sulci on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere are the parieto-occipital sulcus. From its name, it is between the parietal and the occipital lobe, and the calcarine sulcus also in the posterior part. The parieto-occipital sulcus begins some distance anterior to the occipital pole, and it passes downward and anteriorly يعني لتحت والى الامام on the medial surface to meet the calcarine sulcus. هلا راح نشوفهم. يعني الباريتو occipital هون راح يكون في المنطقة الخلفية تقريبا. This is the parietal lobe. Okay, sorry, this is the parietal lobe, this is the occipital, this is the parietal occipital. Okay, so this is the parieto occipital in here separating the parietal from the occipital, and from it we will have the calcarine sulcus or line. تمام. The calcarine sulcus, it commences under the posterior end of the corpus callosum وبالتالي هي موجودة على posterior end. تمام. السبلينيوم سميناها السبلينيوم. تمام. of the corpus callosum and arches upward and backward to reach the occipital pole. occipital pole يعني الجهة الخلفية من الأوكسيبيتال يعني القمة تبعتها where it stops. تمام. طبعا هاي معلومات يعني عشان نفهم الدايركشن تبعها، بس هلا احنا راح نفهمهم بشكل أفضل. اللي راح يصير هلا إنه أنا راح أحكي عن الفرونتال temporal occipital parietal lobe anatomy. بعد هيك راح نروح على الfunctional areas again from frontal parietal temporal. Okay, so we're starting with the frontal lobe. It occupies the area anterior to the central sulcus. خلينا نشرح كل هاي الأمور على هذا الفيجر. Okay, this is an amazing figure that illustrates all of the sulci and gyri and the lateral superficial figure. This is in here the central sulcus. If we just observe it with the color, oops, sorry. So starting with this figure, this is the frontal in here. This is the parietal lobe, and this is the temporal, and this is the occipital. So starting with the most important sulcus in the brain or the cerebral hemisphere, the central sulcus. The central sulcus is the most superficial one, and follow just the pointer. This is the central sulcus. Okay, so This is the central sulcus. It separates the frontal from the parietal, okay? So the central sulcus separates the frontal from the parietal lobe. It will have two projections or gyres. Anterior to it is the precentral gyrus, and posterior to it is the postcentral gyrus. So this is the central sulcus separating the frontal from the parietal lobe, having the postcentral gyrus in here and the precentral gyrus. In here, in the frontal lobe, we'll be able to see that anterior to the precentral gyrus, there is a two sulcus. This is the superior frontal sulcus in here. Okay, this is the superior frontal sulcus, and in here we have the inferior. Okay, this is the inferior. If you just observe it like this way, okay, this is the inferior. Okay, and both of them extending toward the central sulcus. Okay, so this is the superior and this is the inferior frontal sulcus. Above the superior frontal sulcus, we'll have the superior frontal gyrus, and below the superior frontal sulcus and above the inferior frontal sulcus, this is the middle frontal gyrus, and inferior to the frontal sulcus, this is the inferior frontal gyrus. So we have superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyrus that is being separated by both the superior and the inferior frontal sulcus. Going now to the posterior part of the central sulcus. Again, this is the central sulcus that separates frontal from the parietal lobe and having the precentral and the postcentral gyrus. Going to talk about the parietal lobe. In here, there is a postcentral sulcus. So the postcentral sulcus, again, sorry, I did not mention that we have a precentral sulcus in here that will give rise to the inferior one. And also, as we have precentral gyrus, of course, we have the precentral sulcus that separate the two precentral gyrus, this one and this one, okay? And we're about these two. And also at the posterior part of the central sulcus, we have the postcentral gyrus that is being separated by the postcentral sulcus or posterior to it, okay? Now, at the medial aspect of the postcentral sulcus, we will have a vertical in here sulcus called the intraparietal sulcus, and this intraparietal sulcus that is extremely going ventrically like this way will separate the parietal lobe into both superior parietal lobe and inferior parietal lobe. And of course, the inferior parietal lobe and the superior parietal lobe is composed of another gyrus and sulci. Going to the occipital pole in here, the occipital pole meaning it's the most part of the occipital lobe that is being sectioned by the parietal lobe by the parieto-occipital sulcus that will give us another sulci, the one that we have mentioned before a moment. And in here, the temporal sulcus. There is another important sulcus called the lateral sulcus. So in here, this is the side where we will have the lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus is going to extend upward to form the anterior ascending ramus of the lateral sulcus, and in here, this is the anterior horizontal ramus, okay? This is the anterior horizontal because it is horizontal in shape, and this is the anterior ascending, and it will follow backward to have the posterior ramus. So again, the lateral sulcus have three things. We have the anterior ascending ramus, the anterior horizontal ramus, and one posterior ramus. Those are the part of the lateral sulcus, okay? So again, this is the lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus at this portion, the doctor said that it's coming from the inferior part of the cerebral hemisphere, and once it reaches this portion in here at the medial aspect or the anterior medial aspect, it's going to separate into anterior ascending and anterior horizontal, okay? This is the anterior ascending and this is the anterior horizontal, okay? And aware that posteriorly is going to have the posterior ramus. If you just observe in here, talking about the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe, again, the lateral sulcus separate the frontal and the parietal lobe above from the lateral, from the temporal lobe below. So again, the lateral sulcus separate the frontal and the parietal lobe above it from the temporal lobe below it. Actually, the temporal lobe have a similarity within the frontal lobe. However, it have a differentiation between the sulcus. Why? Because it have superior sulcus, superior temporal sulcus, but we do not have an inferior. We have the middle temporal sulcus, and as you know, we have the superior and the middle and the inferior temporal gyrus. So again, we have the superior one in here. Okay, so this is the superior temporal gyrus, separating the middle temporal, this is the superior temporal sulcus, separating the middle temporal gyrus from the superior temporal gyrus, and in here we have the inferior. This is the inferior temporal sulcus, separating the middle, in here, the middle temporal gyrus from the inferior temporal gyrus. So these are the sulci and the most important gyrus in the lateral surface. Aware that I am talking about the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere, and the most important two is the central sulcus and the lateral sulcus. If we get back to the handout, you'll be able to see that it's very easy right now to talk about these information. The frontal lobe occupies the area anterior to the central sulcus. Yeah, it is anterior to the central sulcus and superior to the lateral sulcus. Yeah, we know that. Okay, so it is above the lateral sulcus and anterior to the central sulcus. It is divided into 4 gyri. Yes, we know them. It is the precentral gyrus that is anterior to the central sulcus, the superior frontal, the middle frontal, and the inferior frontal. It's very easy right now, yeah? So it lies, the precentral gyrus lies between the precentral sulcus and the central sulcus. Yeah, if you just observe in here, this is the central sulcus in here, and this is the precentral sulcus. As we have mentioned that the precentral gyrus have precentral sulcus. And the precentral gyrus is located between the precentral in here. This is the precentral, okay? This is the precentral sulcus and the central sulcus, okay? Again, we have the superior frontal gyrus lies superior to the superior frontal sulcus. Middle frontal gyrus lie between the superior and inferior frontal sulcus, and the inferior frontal gyrus lies inferior to the inferior frontal sulcus. All of these things we have talked about. However, the parietal lobe occupies the area posterior to the central sulcus. Yes, we said that, and superior to the lateral sulcus, because we said that the lateral sulcus separate the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe above them. So both the parietal lobe and the frontal lobes being superiorly to the lateral sulcus and inferior to the lateral sulcus, we have the temporal lobe. So the parietal lobe extends posteriorly as far as the parieto-occipital sulcus. Again in here, the parietal lobe extending from the central sulcus, going posteriorly and downward until having the parieto-occipital sulcus to separate it from the occipital lobe backward. It is divided into 3 gyri. Yes, we know that also. The post-central gyrus looks like the precentral gyrus, lies between the central sulcus and the post-central sulcus. Again in here, it lies between the central sulcus, this one in here, and the post-central sulcus is the post-central gyrus. And it has also the superior parietal gyrus and the inferior parietal gyrus. We name these ones lobule. Why do we name them lobule? Because these gyrus are sub-categorizing places or gyrus that's going to be also dividing to another gyrus superior to the intraparietal sulcus. You remember that the intraparietal sulcus is rising from the post-central sulcus, dividing the parietal lobe into both superior parietal lobule and inferior parietal lobule. And aware that we name them lobule because they are large component of the parietal lobe, having another gyri and sulci. Okay, so they are large. Okay, so the superior parietal gyrus superior to the intraparietal sulcus. It is superior to the intraparietal sulcus and runs posteriorly from the middle of the post-central sulcus. You know what is the post-central sulcus? It runs posteriorly. Yes, حكينا إنه هذا vertical line أو الإيش intraparietal sulcus separate the parietal lobe into superior to it, superior parietal lobule or gyri, and inferior to it, the inferior parietal lobule. Okay, so it runs posteriorly from the middle of the post-central sulcus. And sorry, this is the post-central sulcus. This is the intraparietal, okay? So this is the post-central sulcus. And if you observe that the superior parietal lobule is located posteriorly، يعني خلف وين هي البوست-central sulcus هو بيجي ايش؟ خلفه، تمام؟ However, the inferior parietal gyrus inferior to the intraparietal sulcus. أيوه inferior to تحته، وبالتالي inferior parietal lobule is located inferiorly to the intraparietal sulcus, and the superior one is located superior to the intraparietal sulcus, and the superior parietal lobule is located posteriorly to the post-central sulcus. Talking about the temporal lobe occupies the area inferior to the lateral sulcus. Yes, we know that, and aware that the central sulcus do not reach the temporal lobe at all. It is divided into 3 gyri, the superior, the middle, the inferior, having 2 sulci that differs from the frontal one. the superior temporal gyrus is superior to the superior temporal sulcus, and the middle temporal gyrus, it is located between the superior and the middle. This is the middle, okay? It is not the inferior. In case of the frontal lobe, this is going to be the inferior. However, in the temporal, it is middle, not inferior. So in the temporal lobe, we do not have inferior temporal sulci. We only have superior and middle temporal sulci. That the middle temporal gyrus is located between them. And finally, the inferior temporal gyrus, that is inferior to the middle temporal sulcus, okay? And the inferior temporal gyrus, it is continued into the inferior surface of the hemisphere. So if you observe this picture, this is the inferior surface of the hemisphere. Look how the inferior surface of the hemisphere is you are looking from another side in here. Okay, this is the inferior surface of it, الجزء التحتاني. وإذا لاحظنا إنه this is the temporal lobe in here, we'll be able to see that the inferior temporal gyri is connected to the inferior portion of the cerebral hemisphere. Again, this is the inferior temporal gyrus connecting to the inferior part of the cerebral hemisphere as mentioned here. Okay, going to the last lobe together, this is the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe occupies the small area behind the parieto-occipital sulcus, and we said it is divided by the calcarean sulcus into the cuneus and the lingual gyrus. Actually, it is not illustrated in this picture, but we are going to look for it in a moment. Again, talking about the occipital lobe that is posteriorly to the parietal lobe, actually this is a medial aspect. So aware that before a moment we were looking to the lateral surface. However, to see the occipital lobe projections, we need to look at the medial aspect. This is what? This is the parieto-occipital sulcus, separating the parietal lobe anteriorly from the occipital lobe posteriorly. And if you observe this line in here, this is the calcarean sulcus or fissure that is rising out to the parieto-occipital, and this is the calcarean in here, okay? And separate the occipital lobe into both the cuneus and the lingual gyrus. Again, it separates the occipital lobe, the calcarean sulcus separate the occipital lobe into both cuneus and lingual gyrus. And you have observed that anterior to the cuneus we have the precuneus, and as you know, the precuneus is located between the parieto-occipital sulcus posteriorly and between something called the cingulate gyrus anteriorly. This is the cingulate sulcus, okay? So the precuneus is located anteriorly to the cuneus and is located between the parieto-occipital sulcus posteriorly and the cingulate sulcus anteriorly. Actually, this is the corpus callosum. As you know, the anterior genium and the posterior splenium and the trunk of it, and superior or above the corpus callosum, we have the cingulate gyrus. This is the gyrus that is located in the medial aspect of the brain or the cerebral hemisphere, and above the cingulate gyrus, there is the cingulate sulcus, and the precuneus is actually located between the parieto-occipital sulcus and anteriorly within the cingulate sulcus. Looking in here, this is actually the central sulcus. Sorry, this is the central sulcus, okay? There is something called, we said that the anterior to the central sulcus, we have the precentral gyri. Between the central sulcus and the precentral sulcus, there is the precentral gyrus, and posterior to the central sulcus, there is the post-central gyri that is located between the central sulcus anteriorly and the post-central sulcus posteriorly, okay? So there is something called the paracentral. We said anteriorly, precentral, and postcentral. This is para, okay? It's not pre, nor post. It is paracentral lobule, and it is not a gyri. It is a lobule. Actually, this lobule is only seen in the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere, and it is composed of the following. Okay, follow my words. It is composed of the following. First of all, it is composed of the medial aspect of the precentral gyrus that is located at the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Again, the paracentral lobule have an anterior and posterior part that is separated by the central sulcus. Okay, the paracentral lobule is made up of the medial extension. الميديال extension يعني الجهة الميديالي تبعت البري-central gyrus. هذا البري-central gyrus وين موجود؟ على lateral surface. Again, it is made up of the medial extension of the post-central gyrus. هذا post-central gyrus شو ماله؟ Located laterally. This is the paracentral lobule, and this is the occipital loops, as we have mentioned before, okay? This is the occipital lobe, and we said that it occupies the small area behind the parieto-occipital sulcus, and you need to know that it is divided by the calcarine sulcus that we have seen into the cuneus and the lingual gyrus, and anterior to the cuneus, the pre-cuneus that is located between the cingulate sulcus and the parieto-occipital sulcus. One more thing to mention, that if we just get back to the frontal, parietal, and occipital, and the four temporal lobes of the cerebral hemisphere, we have something called the insula. Actually, this is the insula, and if you observe, this is the projection or the place of the lateral sulcus. So if you just say that the insula, if we remove the lateral sulcus and its superior part and inferior little part, we'll be able to see that this is the two insula, okay? These two portions are the insula, okay? Now, moving back to something called the cingulate gyrus and the paracentral lobule. Remember that before a moment that I have defined the paracentral lobule, that it is the place. This place in here, the paracentral lobule, actually it is only seen in the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere, okay? So, what is its definition of the paracentral lobule? Is the area of the cerebral cortex. Yeah, of course, it is an area of the cerebral cortex because it's located superficially and surrounds the indentation. And the indentation, it is the free space, meaning المسافة الفارغة, المساحة الفارغة, المكان الفاضي that is being produced by the central sulcus. You know that central sulcus is located more superficially and laterally, and medially it is deficient, meaning which will leave a free space that's going to be occupied by the paracentral lobule. So the paracentral lobule is being surrounded by the indentation produced by the central sulcus on the superior border, okay? So it is located superiorly. As we have mentioned, its anterior part is the continuation of the precentral gyrus. البريسنترال جارس شو ماله؟ located at the superior lateral surface. وبالتالي البريسنترال جارس هم دائما laterally، ولكن يعني الانتير part is the continuation of the precentral gyrus. الدكتورة سمته هذا الكونتينيويشن medial extension، تمام؟ البوستير part is the continuation، سمته الدكتورة ايش؟ medial extension of the post-central gyrus، لأن البوست-central gyrus posterior to the central sulcus، وبالتالي posterior part is the continuation of the post-central gyrus on the superior lateral surface. زي ما حكينا in here. This is the paracentral lobule. Again, it is the anterior part is the medial extension or the continuation of the precentral gyrus that is located superficial lateral, and its posterior part is the medial extension of the postcentral gyrus that is located superficial lateral. Again, this is in here the cingulate gyrus. The cingulate gyrus begins beneath the anterior end of the corpus callosum and continues above the corpus callosum until it reaches the posterior end. Look in here. This is the corpus callosum, okay? And this is the cingulate gyrus. If you just observe that it is extending from the anterior part of the corpus callosum, going backward to its posterior part, okay? And in here, we'll be able to see that this is another picture that illustrates the corpus callosum in here. Okay, sorry, this is the corpus callosum and the anterior part. I think this is the thalamus. This is the geno of the corpus callosum and the splenium of the corpus callosum. More superior to it, we will have the cingulate gyrus, okay? And superior to that cingulate gyrus, we'll be able to see the cingulate sulcus, okay? So, the cingulate gyrus, حكينا وين الموقع تبعها beneath anterior begins beneath the anterior end of the corpus callosum، يعني تحت الايش الانتيريور end، هنا تحت الانتيريور end تبعت الcorpus callosum، and continue above the corpus callosum until it reaches its posterior end. بتضلها مكملة فوق الcorpus callosum، بتلف 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 حتى ما توصل للposterior part تبعت مين؟ تبعت الcorpus callosum، تمام؟ هذه هي cingulate gyrus. It is separated from the corpus callosum by something called the callosal sulcus. الcallosal sulcus, this is the callosal sulcus، هيو اللي بالأحمر، تمام؟ Okay, so this is the callosal sulcus separating the corpus callosum from the cingulate gyrus, and it is also separated from the superior frontal gyrus by the cingulate sulcus. قبل شوي حتى حكينا عن الcingulate في منطقة البري-كيونيس، تتذكروا لما حكينا هون عندك كيونيس and the lingual gyrus that is separated by the calcarine sulcus in the occipital lobe. حكينا عندك البري-كيونيس اللي هي موجودة between the parieto-occipital sulcus and the cingulate sulcus. وبالتالي cingulate gyrus is located between the cingulate sulcus superiorly and something called the coalesal sulcus inferiorly. Going back to the functional areas of both the frontal, the temporal, parietal, and the occipital loops, okay? Okay, going to the difficult part of this lecture, the functional layers. Actually, it is easy if you just understand the true concept. Okay. صراحة الدكتورة ما حكت كثير عنهم غير الموجود هنا، ما كثير توسعت فيهم. تمام. The frontal lobe, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobe have a functional areas that have a major function. Okay. لما احكي كلمة motor anterior، لما احكي كلمة sensory posterior، بس ركزوا لي على هاي الشغلة هلا. تمام. هلا The frontal lobe contains the following functional areas. يعني عن جد الدكتورة ما طلعت عن الحكي الموجود هنا إلا في بعض الجمل، هذا هو المهم نحفظه. تمام. We have primary motor area, premotor area, supplementary motor area, frontal eye field, motor speech أو بنسميها مرات البروكاس area، الناس بغلبها بسموها بروكاس area، and the prefrontal cortex. هاي البرودمان area 44 و45 و86 اللي حكينا قبل شوي البرودمان area اللي هي numbered based on the psychoarchitecture. اوكي تبعت هاي المناطق. اوكي starting with the primary motor area، بس اعرفوا المكتوب هنا. تمام. اول شيء اعرفوا الرقم، الدكتوره ما حكت عنهم ولا حتى ما حكتهم ما قراتهم، يعني بس اعرفوا الرقم بشكل عام. تمام. It occupies the anterior wall of the central sulcus. إذا هيك نحن بنحكي عن السنترال sulcus. So it occupies the anterior wall of the central sulcus and the adjoining part of the paracentral lobule. تتذكروا الانتيريور part of the paracentral lobule ايش كان؟ اللي هو عباره عن ايش؟ البري سنترال جايرس. اذا الادجويننج بارت المقصود فيها adjoining لمين؟ للانتيريور وول تبع السنترال سلكس، وبالتالي الباراسنترال لوبيول. where unilateral lesions result in paralysis on the contralateral side. ايش معنى unilateral و contralateral؟ unilateral يعني رجل واحده مش الرجلتين، ايد واحده مش الايدتين. لما احكي لك bilateral the two eyes, the two hands, the two arms, the two legs. لما احكي لك unilateral one leg, one eye, one hand، يعني إشي واحد. contralateral side of the body، يعني لما احنا نيجي نطلع على البرين من هذه المنطقة هنا، المنطقة مثلا هاي خلينا نعتبرها الموتور اريا، هذا السنترال سلكس هي بتكون this is the primary motor area anterior to it with the adjoining ايش paracentral lobule. تمام. هلا هاي primary motor area، إذا أنا بحكي عن ال primary motor area that is located in the left side of the cerebral hemisphere which means it controls the right side of the body. إذا أنا بطلع على right side of the cerebral hemisphere it controls the lateral side، يعني يمين شمال شمال يمين، بس اعكسهم. إذا كانت شمال في الدماغ بتكون بتتحكم في الجهة اليمين من الجسم، and if it was right in the brain it controls the left side of the body. Okay. So going back to the primary motor area, if you observe this is the primary motor area. Again, this is the central sulcus. Okay, this is the primary motor area which is anterior to the central sulcus and having the adjoining part of the paracentral lobule. وزي ما حكينا إلها وظيفة في unilateral lesions، يعني unilateral lesion لو صار عندك lesions في هاي المنطقة راح يصير لك paralysis on the contralateral. زي ما حكينا كانت شمال بصير يمين الباراlysis، يمين بصير شمال. Secondly, the premotor area، هذه primary motor، هذه premotor. The location of it is in the anterior part of the precentral gyrus. هلا ال precentral gyrus تتذكروه اللي هو عبارة عن ايش؟ anterior to the central sulcus. هذا هو. حكينا انه this is the precentral gyrus. Okay. So anterior to it we will have the premotor area and the more posterior part of the superior frontal gyrus. Remember the superior frontal gyrus in here. So this is the superior frontal gyrus, and in here this is the precentral. Okay, so this is the precentral and this is the superior. So it is located in this region. Actually the location is not يعني بالموقع مش مهم، بالنظر مش مهم كثير نعرفه، ولكن المهم نعرف الجمل اللي تبعته. ولكن احنا عشان نسهل الموضوع this is the premotor area. This is with number 6 approximately. This is ما تطلعوا على الارقام لانه الارقام هي المهمه اللي هون. تمام. هاي الارقام. تمام. زي ما حكينا 4 هي عباره عن ايش؟ primary motor. 6 broadband 6 هي عباره عن ايش؟ premotor cortex. حكينا anterior to the precentral sulcus and with the superior frontal gyrus. Third of them is the supplementary motor area, broadband area 6 on the medial surface. يعني هي 6 بس على مين؟ على الميديال surface. ننزل شوية لتحت. تمام. هلا it lies in the medial part of the superior frontal gyrus. Where is the superior? In here, in this region. This is the superior frontal gyrus. هي بتكون في المنطقة التحتانية. يعني هذه رقم 6 broadband have two parts. The premotor cortex and the supplementary motor area. الدكتورة بس حكت عن الموقع تبعها. Again, fourth, the frontal eye field, broadband area 8. It is located chiefly in the middle frontal gyrus. This is the middle frontal gyrus in this location. And if you observe that the frontal eye field is located posterior to it, in the middle. Okay, in the middle, in here, in the middle frontal gyrus, we will have the frontal eye field. The frontal eye field is located chiefly in the middle frontal gyrus extending into the superior frontal gyrus. يعني هو ما بين المنطقة middle frontal gyrus extending to the superior. هيها 8 تمام. This is the frontal eye field. And unilateral lesion result in a transitory paralysis of the conjugate eye movement. هذا المنطقة بتلعب على muscles of the eye تمام. فبالتالي conjugate eye movement to the opposite side زي ما حكينا يمين بشمال وشمال بيمين. يعني unilateral lesion result in a transitory paralysis بصير عندك شلل في conjugate eye movement to the opposite side اللي هي الجهة المقابلة. Fifth of them is the motor speech or the broadcast area. البرودكاست area جدا مهمة رقمها 44 ومرات 45. Okay. It is situated in the opercular and the triangular parts. ولا حكت الدكتور عنه مش غير انه ايش هيك زي ما هم. اوكي. اذا الاوبريكولار and triangular parts of the inferior frontal gyrus. فوق حكينا عن الميدل frontal gyrus وكمان حكينا superior تمام. هون عندك inferior frontal gyrus of the hemisphere dominant for language. كلمة hemisphere dominant معناته left على طول. ايش يعني hemisphere dominant؟ لو ما اجي اطلع هنا في عندك ايش؟ One of the two cerebral hemisphere is more dominant than the other which is the left in most of the people. تمام؟ هذا اللي حكته عنه الدكتورة. And it brings about the formation of the words. كيف الواحد بيحكي كيف برتب الكلمات تبعته؟ هو عبارة عن وظيفة الموتور speech or the broadcast area. This is the broadcast area. وينها؟ This is the broadcast area. Two areas حكينا في هذه المنطقة between the inferior frontal gyrus. هيها هذا ايش triangular and opercular parts of the inferior frontal gyrus بتعمل على formation of the words. Finally the prefrontal cortex or area the prefrontal. أنا فوق عندي premotor هنا prefrontal cortex. It is referred to as the frontal association cortex. It is the largest between the frontal lobe. This area all of these regions in here is called the prefrontal cortex. It is composed of a lot of functional area of the frontal lobe. It is referred to as the frontal association cortex or the prefrontal cortex. It is divided into two main regions. هي في عندك كثير regions كل هذول الريجن بيحتوي على يعني موجودين في prefrontal cortex, but the doctor mentioned the orbital region that is associated with the social behavior. كيف السلوك تبع الإنسان يعني بركض كثير هيك مثلا طفل كان كثير بيشاغب أو شيء social behavior السلوك تبعه هون in the orbital region. and ما حد يفكر orbital إلها دخل بالآي لا إلها دخل بالسوشيال هي orbital لأنها تقريبا قريبة من الآي تمام أو الأوربت تبعت الآي. and the lateral region that it is concerned with the intellectual abilities يعني العقلية والذكائية. So this is the frontal lobe. Going now to the parietal lobe functional areas. Okay, talking about the parietal lobe functional areas. Actually, the parietal lobe functional areas is really a lot of them, okay? The parietal lobe contains the following functional areas. First of all, the primary somatosensory. Before a moment, I said when I say sensory, it means posterior to the central sulcus and motor anterior to the central sulcus. The primary somatosensory area it occupies the post-central gyrus, which is located إيش ماله هذا posterior to the central sulcus and the adjoining part of the paracentral lobule. تتذكروا ايش adjoining part تبع post يعني ايش adjoining part of the paracentral lobule in the posterior side اللي هو مين posterior gyrus تمام. اذا the adjoining part يعني الجزء بس من البوستيريال من الباراسنتال لوبيول ومع البوستنتال جارس. where lesions لو صار عندك ضرب او injury في هذه المنطقة result in loss of tactile discrimination and proprioception on the contralateral sides. يعني الإحساسات هذه كلها وينها على الجهة المقابلة يعني زي ما حكينا يمين شمال شمال يمين تمام. هاي هي this is the primary. This is 1 2 3 all of them are in the primary somatosensory area and this is the central sulcus. It is posterior to them in the post-central gyrus and the adjoining part of the paracentral lobule. Going to the secondary somatosensory area, it is located in the parietal operculumine and the posterior part of the insula. تتذكروا الانسولا اللي حكينا it is ايش واحدة من اللوبس ولكن وراء وخلف ايش الليترال لوب. وبالتالي هاي الصورة مستحيل احنا نشوفها صعب جدا نشوفها لانه الانسولا هون داخلية صعب نشوف هاي الموتور اريا يعني او سوري السكندري سوماتوسنسوري اريا. ايش هو الاوبركيولومنت؟ في هون احنا صورة this picture in here illustrate this is the operculum تمام. الاوبركيولومنت هو عبارة عن هاي المنطقة وراها بيكون عندك الانسلا. هنا انت عندك frontal parietal عندك orbital 1 عندك frontal parietal 1 يعني عندك واحدة temporal. انا بتهمني الباريتال سوري This is the parietal one. Okay, this is the operculum. تمام. هلا انا هاي هي اللي بتهمني. ف it is located in the parietal مش الفرونتال ولا الاوربيتال، الباريتال operculum end and the posterior part of the insula. وانا يمكن نشوفها بهي الصوره، وحاولت ابحث عن صوره لها ما لقيت لها secondary somatosensory area. The primary gustatory cortex اللي هي Brodmann area ايش 43. It is situated in the parietal operculum and the insula. زي الفوقها تقريبا. اوكي، parietal operculum and insula where lesions result in ايش agesia، او بنسميه الايجيزا اللي هو عباره عن loss of sense of taste. تمام، يعني انت لو صار عندك انجري في هاي المنطقه راح تبل ما تحس في طعم الاشياء، بتصير تاكل اشياء بدون ما تحس فيها، ما تستطعم بالشيء. تمام، اذا tasting will be lost from this area. This area is located in here. This is the gustatory area. Okay, this is the primary gustatory cortex that is responsible for tasting. تمام، this is the parietal association areas consisting of. تتذكروا لما حكينا انه انا عندي post central sulcus راح يعطيني interparietal. لو اجينا على هاي الصوره هنا this is the post central sulcus. تتذكروا هذا البوست central sulcus وبعطيني interparietal sulcus عشان يعطيني superior lobule و inferior lobule وسميناه lobule لانه راح ينقسم الاشياء اكثر واكثر. هنا هاي الاشياء انا عندي superior parietal lobule بنسميه Brodmann area 5 and 7. تمام، where lesion result in the contralateral asterogenesis. تمام، asterogenesis اللي هي عباره عن غمض عينيك. يعني انا لو اعطيك مثلا حجر معين واحكي لك غمض، انت ما شفت الحجر، وواحد غمض عينيه ونعطيه الحجر ونحكي له ايش هذا الاشي بالاحساس بايديك، هذا هو the feeling of the astereognosis. تمام، the astereognosis the feeling of things, touching things without looking to them. okay, just visualizing them. يعني انت عم بتحذر الاشي من خلال الاحساس تبعك. فبالتالي superior parietal lobe اللي هي موضحه في هذه المنطقه هون the superior parietal lobe، او اللي هي في هاي المنطقه سميناها احنا 5 و7. هيها this is the superior parietal lobe. This is the interparietal sulcus separating the parietal lobe to the superior and inferior. This is the area 5 and 7, the Brodmann that is responsible for the astereognosis. okay, اللي هو الإحساس بالإشي بدون ما تشوفه بعينيك. The inferior parietal lobe including two gyri, the supramarginal اللي هي Brodmann area 40 and the angular gyrus. وهذول التنتين مسؤولين عن النيجلكت سيندروم. هاي النيجلكت سيندروم يعني نص اليمين تبعك او نص الشمال تبعك انت مش حاسس فيه، انت مش مدرك اصلا انه في عندك نص ثاني. افضل صورة بتوضح هذا الإشي هي الصورة الموجودة هنا. okay, we'll be able to see that this is the neglect syndrome. يعني هذا الجزء اللي هذا الإنسان شايف إنه هو عايش طبيعي وهذا الجزء 100%، ولكن هذا الجزء وإذا بتلاحظوا إنه في هذا الجزء هو لابس جاكيت بدلة، بس بالجزء الثاني it's look like a hoodie. وشوفوا كيف شعره مش حالق لحيته. يعني هذا الجزء مش مهتم فيه، هذا الإنسان مش مدرك إنه عنده هذا البارت. تمام، هذا البارت that is the inferior parietal lobule including two gyri, the supramarginal gyrus and the angular gyrus, that is يعني responsible for the neglect syndrome. يعني contralateral إذا ضربت الجهة اليمين الانفير parietal lobe بصير عنده الشمال. يعني هذا الزلمة جهته اليمين هي اللي ضربت. تمام، وبالتالي مين الانجي راح تكون in the left inferior parietal lobule. تمام، ولو نشوف هاي الصورة هنا this is the superior one, this is the inferior one. مش موضحة عندنا ال two part اللي هم الانجولار والسوبرامارجر، بس هي موجودة في ايش في هاي المنطقة لأنها ايش inferior to the interparietal sulcus. هاي النيجلكت syndrome very very important. تمام. Okay, going now to the occipital lobe. No, actually, sorry, going to the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe functional areas are the following. We have the auditory area, the auditory area and the sensory speech area, أو بنسميها مرات Wernicke's area. Okay, hopefully I punctuated again correctly. Okay, so the auditory area and the sensory speech or the Wernicke's area. The auditory area contain the following: the primary auditory cortex posterior to it, the secondary auditory cortex يعني واحدة primary وواحدة secondary. The primary بتكون anterior والsecondary posterior to the primary. And auditory association area, auditory association area هذه 41 42 هذه 22 و 24. هلا the primary auditory cortex it is situated in the transverse temporal gyri of Heschel. وهذا temporal gyri of Heschel أو Heschel the doctor said that it is inside the lateral sulcus. هذا هو الدكتور حكت عنه. تمام، so it is situated in the transverse temporal gyri. احنا بنعرف انه ما حكينا عن transverse temporal gyri، بس اكيد في عندك كثير gyri غير اللي حكينا عنهم، بس اللي حكينا عنهم هو الدكتور المطالبين فينها. and this is the transverse temporal gyri of the Heschel وهي موجودة في lateral sulcus. لو اجي بطلع هون this is the lateral sulcus separating above the frontal and the parietal lobe and below it the temporal lobe. This is 41 the primary auditory area, and posterior to it this is the secondary auditory area. ودير بالنا انه هاي primary auditory area حكينا يسوي in the transverse temporal gyri of the هيشل. هذا الهيشل بقى موجود هنا تمام في الليترال سلكس. انا في عندي transverse gyri واحده من هذول الجيراي. يعني احنا حكينا انه عندي superior middle and inferior، وبالتالي انا عندي في هاي المنطقه عندك ايش transverse temporal gyri in the هيشل of the lateral sulcus and the auditory association area اللي هي 22 و 24 هيهم تمام. هذه هي 22 تمام. So this is the auditory association, this is the secondary auditory, and this is the primary auditory. Okay, going to the sensory speech. This is very important region in the temporal lobe or vernix area. Why it is important? The location of it mainly in the superior temporal gyrus. As you know, the superior temporal gyrus, this gyrus that is located above the superior temporal sulcus and have an extension. That's why it's very important. It has an extension around the posterior end of the lateral sulcus into the parietal region. So this is the lateral sulcus. This is the anterior part of the lateral sulcus separating the temporal from the frontal lobe, and this is the posterior part. Remember that we have anterior horizontal and anterior ascending, I think, yes, anterior ascending and horizontal ramus of the lateral sulcus and posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. The most posterior part of the lateral sulcus, in here we have an extension of the sensory speech or the vernix area. So it has an extension around the posterior end of the lateral sulcus in here that is going to get inside the parietal region. So if there was a question in the exam, which of the following have an extension between the temporal bone functional areas have an extension to the parietal region? It is what? It is the sensory speech or the vernix area. And it permits language comprehension. يعني إتقان اللغة تمام. Comprehension of the language receives fibers from the visual cortex and the auditory cortex. تتذكروا الفيجوال cortex والauditory cortex. الauditory cortex اللي حكينا عنها فوق في هاي المنطقة تمام. هيها تمام اللي هي عند lateral sulcus، والفيجوال area هي مفروض هيها هنا الفيجن اللي هي the most posterior part. شوفوا سبحان الله يعني الفيجن بتكون anterior. It is the most anterior part of the brain. بتلاقيها إيش؟ posterior. فالbrain is contralateral to the body's part. Again, this is the vision and this is the auditory side. This is the superior temporal gyrus that contains the speech area, and the speech area will receive fibers from the visual cortex and the auditory cortex. وبالتالي auditory cortex من فوقها والvisual cortex من وراها من هنا تمام. And final information about it that it is connected to the Broca area by the arcuate fasciculatus. تتذكروا الاركويت اللي حكينا عن columnar or columns, vertical columns in the sixth layer of the cerebral cortex. حكينا انه انا عندي ايش association fibers within the same hemisphere. واحدة منهم كانت الاركويت fasciculatus وكانت fasciculus, and it was from the longer one not the short one. Finally the temporal association cortex. حكينا عن ايش auditory sensory او سميناها vernix. Finally the temporal association cortex هذه موجودة في الميدل والinferior temporal gyri تمام. هاي الميدل وهي الانفيريور جايراي. دير بالنا انه احنا حكينا هون في عنا ايش only superior temporal sulcus and middle, not like the frontal we have superior and inferior sulcus. No, we have superior temporal sulcus and middle temporal sulcus, and it is located in the middle and inferior temporal gyri, and it stores auditory and visual information, meaning that يعني انت قبل 7 سنين سمعت صوت شخص انت بتعرفه وسافر هذا الشخص، وبعد 5 سنين هذا الشخص انت ما شفته قدام عينيك بس سمعت صوته. هل انت قادر على انك تتعرف انه هذا الشخص من صوته بتعرفه؟ Yes you can. This is the major responsibility of the temporal association cortex. في هاي المنطقة انت قادر انك تتعرف على اشي انت سمعته، يعني الهيستوري تبعت الهيرنج. ومثلا انت حضرت محاضرة لدكتور قبل 2 سنين، وبعد 2 سنين شفت هذا الدكتور بس شفته بدون ما تشوف المحاضرة، هل انت قادر انك تعرف شكل هذا الدكتور؟ Yes. So it stores information, visualizing information and auditory information. Okay. Okay, ending the functional areas with the occipital lobe. As you know, the occipital lobe is the most posteriorly and located inferior to the parieto-occipital, as we had said in here, parieto-occipital, and is by the calcarine sulcus in the cuneus and the lingual gyrus. Now, the occipital lobe contains the following functional areas. It is only 2 of them, the primary visual area and the visual association areas. Always the association is supporting the primary area, okay? The primary visual area its number is broader than 17. It's also called the striate area. This is very important. The doctor said about it that it is called also the striate area. It is located in the cuneus. Remember the cuneus, the upper border of the calcarine, and the lingual gyri, the lower border of the calcarine sulcus, forming the walls of the calcarine fissure. So if we observe in here, and if we observe in here, we'll be able to see this is the primary visual area. And remember, this is the calcarine. We have above it the cutaneous and the lingual below it. So these areas, the primary visual area, it is located in the cutaneous and the lingual gyri that we know them, forming the walls of the calcarine fissure. It is for vision. From its name, we can indicate that it is for vision. Where a lesion, any injury in this or lesion in this area, result in the contralateral homonymous hemanopsia. The hemanopsia meaning that you can be able to see half of the vision of your eye. And the best picture in here, this is that illustrate the hemanopsia, that you can only observe half of the vision or direction or the transverse section of your eye. يعني انت قادر انك تشوف فقط نصف اللي بتعطيك اياه عينيك. تمام؟ هذا هو المقصود في كلمة الهيمانوبسيا, because it is responsibility, the major responsibility for it is the visualizing. تمام؟ وهي هاي المنطقة, it is the most posterior part. زي ما حكينا vision is the most anterior, وبالتالي المنطقة تبعتها most posterior. This is the primary visual cortex. However, the visual association areas, both brand 18 and 19, more anterior to the primary visual area, the 18 and 19, also located in the in the lingual gyrus and the cuneus, and they interpret input from the primary visual cortex. This is the primary visual cortex. كل المعلومات اللي بتيجي لي على primary visual area, مين اللي بقوم بمعالجتها وتخزينها؟ interpret معناته زي معالجة. تمام؟ So أي معلومات or input coming from the primary visual cortex will be interpreted by this visual association. I said that association meaning helping the primary one, and project to the temporal and parietal association cortex. تتذكروا انه احنا حكينا بالباريتال بالtemporal lobe, حكينا في عندك temporal association cortex اللي موجوده في الميدل وفي الانفيريور, it stores auditory visual information history. وحكينا كمان بالباريتال انا عندي الباريتال association area اللي هي superior وانفيريور, والانفيريور قسمناها الى تنتين, والليشن تبعتها سميناها النيجلت سيندروم اللي ايش جزء من النصف الثاني من الانسان ما بكون مدرك عنه, والسوبيريور باريتال لوب. تتذكروا. وبالتالي هذه المنطقة هون الفيجوال association areas تبعت الأوكسيبيتال لوب, it will project the temporal and the parietal association cortex. In this picture in here, يعني احنا هيك خلصنا كل الفانكشنال areas. في كمان شغلة الدكتورة حكتهم وما حطتهم بالهاند اوت. تمام؟ هلا this is the cuneus. This is the lingual gyrus in the occipital lobe. This is the calcarine sulcus. If you just go anterior to the lingual gyrus, you will be able to see another gyrus that is called the parahippocampal gyrus. Okay, so lingual gyrus is located between the calcarine sulcus above and the collateral sulcus. This is the collateral sulcus below it. Okay, in here we will be able to see the collateral sulcus, and anterior to the lingual gyrus will be able to see the parahippocampal gyrus. Okay, so this is the parahippocampal gyrus, which terminate anteriorly with a hook-like structure called the ancus. Okay, so this is the parahippocampal gyrus that is located anteriorly to the lingual gyrus and terminate more anteriorly with the hook-like structure, small depression called the ancus. The cingulate gyrus, you know, this is the cingulate gyrus plus the septal area. Septal area is a projection in here. You'll be able to see the septal area from this figure. This is the septum. Okay, this is the septal area. So the cingulate gyrus in here, thus the septa in here, and the parahippocampal gyrus 1, 2, and 3, all of them can be named as the limbic loop. Now we have the frontal, the parietal, and the occipital, and the temporal lobe. Those are the major loops, but of course we have minor secondary loops like the limbic loop that is composed of the cingulate gyrus, the septum, and the parahippocampal gyrus. One more thing to mention that the doctor have mentioned also and did not include in the handout. This is the cortical homonyculus. The cortical homonyculus is two of them. We have the motor one in here, or it is any portion that contain all of the motor areas. It is a portion in the brain or the cerebral hemisphere containing all the sensory areas. Okay, so what I want you to know that the anterior, this is the cerebral sulcus. Anterior to it we have the motor area. Posterior to it we have the sensory area. Anterior to it we have all of the motor area. What the doctor wants from us to know about it, and what did she mention in the lecture, that it is demarcated in an upside down demarcation, meaning that, and contralateral also, okay? We know that it is contralateral, meaning right and left, left and the right, right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. Anyway, the foot, for example, the leg, the trunk is located more superior, and these areas are most inferior and lower in the body. However, the face and the neck, the tongue, the pharynx, the larynx, all of these are projections that are located in the most superior part of the human body is located in the most inferior part of the cortical homonyculus. So that's why it is upside demarcated. يعني الأجزاء السفلية من الجسم بلاقيها يتم السيطرة عليها من الأجزاء العلوية من البرين، ونفس القضية في الأجزاء العلوية من الجسم like the face and the neck, the tongue, the pharynx, the larynx، الحنجرة واللسان، كل هاي الأشياء العلوية بلاقيها إيش من الأشياء السفلية في البرين. وكمان aware the differences، يعني شوف الهاند قديش ضخم المنطقة تبعتها، the face كيف إنه المنطقة تبعتها ضخمة. However the foot, the leg have a little area, a small area. So this is the cortical homonyculus اللي هي homonyculus, sorry, and the doctor did not pass over them يعني ما تعمقت فيه كثير. Okay, so the doctor passed over them rapidly. Final thing, I want to talk about the olfactory sulcus. In here, you'll be able to see that this is the olfactory sulcus. Okay, so this is the olfactory sulcus. The doctor mentioned that at the inferior view of the brain, we'll be able to see the olfactory sulcus. So this is the inferior border of the brain, the pons, the medulla oblongata going to the spinal cord. This is the olfactory sulcus. What we need to know that the olfactory sulcus accepts the olfactory nerve, and you know the olfactory nerve is one of the cranial nerves having the number 1, and its major responsibility is smelling, control the smelling. Now this is the olfactory sulcus viewed from the inferior portion of the brain, and it accepts the olfactory nerve. What we need to know actually, or the doctor mentioned, that medial to it we have something that is called the gyrus rectus, and lateral to it, or lateral to the olfactory gyrus, we can see a number of orbital gyri. So this is the rectus gyrus, medial to the olfactory sulcus that accept the olfactory nerve, and lateral to it we have a number of orbital gyrus. So this is the end of the lecture. Hopefully everything was clear, and thank you very much.